I just got back from spending a week as a Hobbit with a community of nearly 1,000 others, and it taught me a lot about how capitalism has found a root in our society, and maybe just a little bit about how to cope with that. The event is called the Brandywine Festival and takes place on a farm in Kentucky. It's basically a few days of camping, cooking, eating, dancing, hiking, more eating, and so much storytelling. It is a LARP, live action roleplay, which means that attendees are expected to fully participate and even drive forward plots and relationships amidst the framework of the event. Most often, this means battles and giant political schemes, but this is Hobbits. So, there were rumors of strange things in the woods that groups went to check out or chase off, court cases over inheritance, young couples sneaking off to get married, and so much merriment. The biggest gossip all week was honestly the smoked mac and cheese. Or maybe that sign painter that ran off with my cousin. I went with a large group of friends, and we set up an entire dressmaking and tailoring shop where we offered assistance and advice all week. Some in the group focused on cooking, others on socialization, and I found my happy little work corner to stitch in, which, I admit, meant that I didn't make it far out of the tent much, but I did have endless amazing interactions at both the event and in the planning Discord for months ahead of time. And I started to notice some things. The more time I spent deeply researching the Shire and talking to people who also had an interest in it, the more obvious the contrast of everyday things around me became. My friends and I started delving deep into the overlap of real history and fantasy, discussing how the Shire would have functioned, how trades would have operated, and what fashion could actually have existed. Coming home after and immediately going back to regular work, dealing with modern problems and media, and cooking by myself was a stark hit of reality, though I did at least have some easing off in the food part, as the sponsor for today's video is HelloFresh. I admit I've had a rough time lately keeping up with eating healthy and managing to cook for myself, much to the chagrin of my Hobbit stomach. But HelloFresh just doubled their menu and added tons of easy and fast options that mean that I can adjust my menu every week for whatever is coming my way. Whether that's a focus on cozy seasonal meals, more veggies, or the easy prep and bake options that mean I can still eat an amazing home-cooked meal with barely any effort. Not only am I managing to eat healthy and fresh, but I'm learning all about cooking along the way. And there's no trip to the busy grocery store or forgotten ingredients just sitting in the fridge. Every week is customized to what I need. You just pick what day the box arrives and choose from an extensive menu of options. If you've got guests swinging by or suddenly have a quiet house, it's really easy to adjust the portion sizes. You can even customize the menu options by swapping out veggies or protein options to make sure that everyone is happy. There are so many choices, and you can see the meals and schedule everything out weeks in advance, so you can set it and forget about it. I love HelloFresh, and I think you would too. Give a second chance to the new HelloFresh by using my code Nicole Rudolph FM at HelloFresh.com for 10 free meals plus free breakfast for life. 1 free meal per box with active subscription. Free meals applied as discount on the first box. New and returning subscribers only. Varies by plan. So sign up today. Click the link below or use my code Nicole Rudolph FM at HelloFresh.com. Thanks again to HelloFresh for keeping my Hobbit lifestyle going a little bit longer. Honestly, it's not unusual to leave these sorts of events with a sudden bit of depression and difficulty right after, but I had already started to connect things that I was experiencing around me at the event with the multitudes of books and articles I've been reading on societal history, as well as, well, everything around me. Especially when it came to capitalism. Now, before anyone finds their way down to the comment section, I'm not talking about the pure form of capitalism, as I get that can't really exist. Political theory is, after all, theory. Instead, I began looking at the changes that took place because of the 19th century industrial shift, something that not only did not happen with the Shire, but was actively resisted as antithetical to their way of life. They do not and did not understand or like machines more complicated than a forge bellows, a watermill, or a hand loom, though they were skillful with tools. The general and only slightly helpful modern definition of capitalism is private ownership over the means of production and their use for obtaining profit. The current use of the term is generally attributed to Karl Marx, which is notable in that the majority of definitions surrounding it are defined by those who do not support it, hence the difficulty in understanding what it actually is. So, rather than try to cobble together a bunch of catchphrases like freedom to act in self-interest or competition regulates the market, I want to look at what happened to industry and how that affected the experience of both consumers and workers. Then we can compare that to our idealistic halfling experience. Industry and machinery is what made capitalism possible, growing out of mercantilism, where governments pushed the growth of industry forward in an effort to have exports exceed imports as a way to bring money to both businesses and the nation/government as a whole. More money, more global power. From here, the industries sort of took off on their own. Because global trade was already set up as a practice, the framework was present as manufacturers moved from trades to large-scale industry. Shopping was done at local stores that either carried imported goods or produced finished products from imported goods. These stores stocked things that their local customers would need and want, and were also within their suitable price range. Customers were less likely to see brand names, instead finding goods from certain areas known for that type of production. Lace from Brussels, printed cotton from India, shoes from Northampton, and so on. Obviously, quality and price of the goods available, as well as service, would impact the success or failure of every local shop. But there was a fairly limited growth model for both shops and manufacturers. It wouldn't make sense for someone with money to start up a shoemaking shop in a random city with cheap labor so they could grow fast and make money. They'd have too much trouble finding skilled labor, specialty supplies, and even just advertising. Instead, they'd start up in an area full of similar industry, so they'd have easy access to leather, last makers, blacksmiths, and other trades that supported theirs, as well as workers ready to go. These regions are what the governments had helped to set up during the era of mercantilism. So, what happened? Well, let's put it in Hobbit terms. Let's say Mr. Brandybuck has a shop in Bywater where all the local farmers and tradespeople sell their wares, so they don't all need a physical shop. That's expensive after all and rather impractical for shoppers as well. He has a good number of customers that come from smaller areas nearby, so the shop is stable in terms of income because there's very little risk. He simply buys goods and sells them for slightly more, or maybe just charges a fee for the space. It's a great relationship with the local producers, but Brandybuck is a bit limited in what's nearby. Maybe he can get wool from a local herder, but to get woven fabrics in stock, he relies on a family of weavers a few towns over who produce lovely wools, perfect for cloaks, breeches, gowns, and more. They have good connections to spinners and dyers nearby. That fabric turns out to be so popular, he decides to work out a deal with some of the family to produce just for his shop. The constant and predictable flow of money means the weavers can build a bigger workspace, hire a few more workers, and maybe upgrade their equipment. But at some point, Mr. Brandybuck is going to run out of local customers. Hobbits don't have newspapers to advertise in for distant customers or catalogs to mail out. No printing presses. So he opens a second shop in Whitfurrows instead, and it's very popular. The demand for the fabric is now more than that single family can manage. So Brandybuck builds an entire workshop, hires on a few of the family, has them train up a bunch of new hobbits that were doing farm work or other physical labor. Of course, the workshop is in a smaller area that doesn't have a lot of trades already established, so it's easy to find workers that will take education for a smaller pay. This might continue to grow for a while, but they're going to run up against a few walls. And not just supply chain issues like how many sheep do they have access to. There's only so many hobbits to buy that fabric, let alone to make it. Even if they started selling fabric to the big folk, most hobbits need to be producing food and basic needs for the community. Unless they started importing that basic stuff from elsewhere, they'd need to drastically shorten the time and effort it takes to make fabric. And this is where the 19th century steps in. The combination of industrial machinery, easier transport, and communication inventions in the 19th century means now manufacturers could be further and further out. Brandybuck suddenly gets access to industrial steam-powered looms that mean one hobbit with almost no training can make 100 yards instead of 1 or 10. That fabric can be quickly sent down the river or by train over the mountains, and he can converse with the big folk by telegram to get orders managed without traveling. Brandybuck creates a company name and logo that becomes well known all the way down in Rohan as being a sign of great, sturdy wool quality. Eventually, Brandybuck passes the business on to his son, who has no interest in it, and sells it off to a wealthy man from Rohan who simply runs it as a way to make as much money as possible, never actually traveling to the Shire beyond that first sale. Okay, we've reached the point where this is sounding more than a little silly. The point is, industry opened up both a manufacturing and customer range that wasn't feasible previously. That doesn't mean people in the past all lived in poverty, obviously. They were just limited to a regional bubble. Industry allows for extremely cheap goods, but also a disparity in income and a drive to purchase more goods. Ours came with multiple population booms that also supported more demand. Maybe that's advertising in Rohan or encouraging a baby boom in the Shire. The main thing preventing this whole growth of business and industry for hobbits isn't just a dislike of machinery or distrust of outsiders. It's that the theory of Hobbit economics is based on the idea that there is enough for everyone. Some do have more than others, but with only a few exceptions, wealth is not intentionally hoarded. People like Lobelia Sackville Baggins are seen poorly for their excessive drive to acquire more wealth. What good would that get her, after all? More stuff in a bigger home is only a positive thing if there's a market that supports that. Maybe you'd have to buy 2 of everything? But why? In our modern world, it's understandable how today the drive is to accumulate wealth to support yourself and a small family circle. Not only have we developed a society where there's always more things to buy, a constantly updating range, but things are unstable. When the loss of a job or even the lack of an annual raise might mean not being able to keep up your home, food, or electricity, more is safety and comfort, not just a bigger TV. It's also why capitalism, as a concept, has to be a bad situation for the majority of people participating in it in order for the unimpeded growth of businesses so that they can maximize profits, there has to be an ever growing demand. That can be created through practical things that are consumable, like potatoes, but for things that should last a long time and don't exactly get improved on regularly, like a potato masher, it's a bit more difficult. Design a product that needs replacing, needs updating, or find a larger market through regional expansion or population growth. All have difficulties, mostly for the consumer after regional expansion is exhausted. Even potatoes have to be advertised today to grow their market. If that constant growth doesn't actually have a benefit, if not only does society start with basic needs being met, but also doesn't have an ever rising ceiling of what wealth can get you, what does that look like? I'll admit, not every hobbit that attended the festival quite got it, and there was a fairly steep learning curve. Well before the event, there were discussions around characters and professions. Quite a few people wanted to be hobbits of means, so that way they wouldn't have to work, which seems reasonable by real life standards. But it quickly became a thought experiment. What does that mean for a character who is attending a festival where very few would be working to begin with? It won't change daily activities. Everyone has free time here, nor would it change what you can actually access at the event. Is it assuming only the wealthy have access to nice things? There were no restrictions on dressing for your job or class, aside from you're going to be spending 4 or more days camping on a farm in Kentucky. Don't dress like it's a fancy ball because you'll have a rough time. Some posited that it was so they could be a helpful hobbit, which does imply that some hobbits are financially in need. Offering to do physical or mental work for those who need the help doesn't need to be a case of monetary gifting. Is it perhaps a respect thing, brought over from the 19th century mindset of class? Well, hobbits do have positions of respect. They tend to be voted in, like mayors, or achieved through work, like judges and doctors. There are some older family names that are thrown about in that way, but a hereditary name does not mean money or vice versa. The conclusion was that it might just be the capitalism clouding our brains. The need to be wealthy whenever possible, even in a pretend circumstance, because that's what makes things less scary. Of note, this is an event in the US with mostly American attendees, and we really don't have simple fallback options for anyone other than the very wealthy who can declare bankruptcy. Even the standard federal programs are a lot of paperwork, very restrictive, and not meant to do much. So that concern is pretty baked in. The event itself is where I really started to notice people grappling with the mindset. Our group arrived early on Monday since we were setting up a shop and not just attending. The other hobbits arrived Tuesday and Wednesday with full in-game starting on Thursday. Important to note because it meant we saw people go from modern clothing and life to slowly but surely figuring out what sort of community this would be. On Tuesday night, after a day of downpours and a very soggy setup, a small expedition from our group went back into town and retrieved pizza. We had more than enough for us and offered it to so many people wandering by and doing work. It took a fight every time for them to just accept pizza. The next day we had our shop open, fire going, lots of food and drink, and still, people were constantly stating how they didn't want to be a bother, didn't want to take something that someone else needed, didn't want to ask for help of any type. But we started seeing everyone offer those things. Gifts started flowing into our shop from people thanking us for the efforts of the last few months. Trinket trading, a pretty standard thing at events like this, was also ramping up. Suddenly, when offered to take part in a cheese board or repairs for a popped-off button, it became acceptable for exchange of a small memento, perhaps a tiny potato or a basket, little bits of art and joy. Turns out many had purchased more than they needed of basic small things as well. Hand fans came just as easily in a pack of 10 with the assumption that others would need them and appreciate it. Now, this tiny gifts traded for tiny acts system is of course not a functional economic structure, nor would trading like this have been standard even 300 years ago. Maybe a roofer had a debt at the tailor shop and the tailor needed a new roof, so they both accounted for the values of each other's labor and adjusted accordingly. I still know a lot of people, especially in trades, historic or modern, that do this from time to time. The prime example of this at the festival was the night market. This event was formulated by a few of the other hobbits and grew more than a little massive. One of the nights under the big entertainment tent, anyone who wanted to could set up a table of wares to, quote, sell. I use that term loosely because no money was exchanged. Sometimes things were traded for other goods, sometimes for a story or a song. And there was an in-game coin system that made it easier to trade without cash. Most of the people filled tables with pottery, accessories, art, lanterns, and all sorts of well-made goods. Nothing manufactured and resold, of course. And the intention was towards people who like to make things, but not on a business scale. It was so popular they held 2 nights of it. A few of my friends had tables set up and ran out extremely fast, had loads of great conversations about what they brought, and ended up with some strange things in return. No one brought goods with an intention of making profits, just as a fun way to share art, skills, and interests. Understandably, again, not a sustainable model for things people need, but it was fascinating to see the social impact of it as a form of entertainment and sharing. Many had also brought far more food and drink than required for the event, knowing that not everyone would have as easy of access. We had a camp of about a dozen with friends that wandered through regularly. As the week went on, we were offered more and more specialty items: gourds, cookies, cured meats, wines, ciders, bread, and so on. Our shared fire pit was in the public areas, so we had plenty of curious hobbits that began to stop by and stay for a snack, often bringing by things that they discovered later, even if it was just good gossip about discoveries on the trail. The camping areas were split into in-game and out-of-game, dependent on whether the tent and setup was modern or not. Both used shared fire pits, and many of the attendees had set up their own little groupings within the spaces. Some were up early to light the fires, others up late to make sure they died out. Water was retrieved from a well on site, and there seemed to always be a constant flow of assistance being offered to help carry it back to the camping areas, or to carry anything back and forth. A small group of us went out to retrieve some heavy things from the car one night and returned with a few new friends that helped hold lanterns and pull carts. There was an entire player-run space coined Cider Burrow in in-game camping, which had a pretty steady flow from the kegs. It was a dry county, so no alcohol sales took place. Just a group of hobbits that really loved cider and wanted to share it. Others had tea carts. We always had coffee. By the time we reached the third day of fully in-game, many had been there for 4 or 5 days by that point, there was no longer pushback when food was offered. No more fussiness of, "Oh, I couldn't, it's your food." Everyone had come to realize that there was more than enough to go around. "Please, take it," had turned an offering from a debt to a surplus. Our sewing shop had been offering assistance on the Discord for months, but barely anyone showed up needing help the first couple of days. They just wanted conversation and to visit. A small mention of a lost button here or there, and we'd launch at them with a thread and needle. We had a large bag of orphaned buttons for this purpose. It wasn't until the final day that those we had been pointedly insisting they just come by for a little help felt up to the task. Their words on the matter, not mine. I lost track of everything that was accomplished as those who came in for longer help ended up sitting and chatting, then offering to do smaller work for the next hobbit in need. I helped to take apart a failed custom order gown and refit it. A few others helped to hem a petticoat. I saw quite a few buttons and ribbon bits head out the door, and so much more. Even in-character exchanges happened much more freely. Lobelia Sackville Baggins was one of the only named characters present, and she had a large court hearing on Bilbo's inheritance. She did lose. Our dressmaking shop had mentioned to a few hobbits offhandedly that we were unable to extend credit because, quote, you-know-who had rung up quite a debt with us, and we weren't able to risk that at a festival. It was intended to be a cute in-character way to say, we can't take credit cards because we're in the middle of a field in Kentucky with no cell service, or we aren't actually selling things in this shop. On the last day, we were delivered a hat full of trinkets and game coins to, quote, settle Lobelia's debt. Lobelia had no knowledge of this plan. The other hobbits had just decided to start a collection. At the beginning of the week, everyone was plenty comfortable with offering assistance or even goods, but there was a continued resistance to accepting them. People who didn't want to take food or anything of value, even time, slowly realized that there was more than enough to go around and everyone wanted to be helpful. Splitting labor made sense. Cooking a meal for one person under those circumstances was just nonsense. The character stories of being wealthy enough to not work also generally failed to materialize, at least commonly enough that I ever heard of it. Most decided that they were adventurous hobbits and went up on the trails to find the ruffians, the giant spider, or elves, or decided that they were very much not an adventurous hobbit and stuck around to play games, watch performances, eat, and talk. Plenty did both. A group that went up to find the ruffians had an impromptu picnic in the woods, ever prepared with an array of cheese and bread in their bags, followed by stealing everything from the troublemakers, including their trash bags, which were properly disposed of back in camp. Obviously, in an ideal situation where nearly everyone is the equivalent of on vacation from reality and has loads of free time, there's more than enough to go around and no one has to focus on working to survive. It's not a realistic, achievable lifestyle. That's not the point. The point is that so many came into the community deeply concerned about not only their character's monetary status, but having learned to not easily take offers from others, as so often it's done out of courtesy, and there's not enough for them to be giving any up, believing that it's somehow embarrassing or lesser to accept assistance, or at least inconvenience others. And there was a visible shift as people not only put on their Hobbit clothing and their character, but the setup of the event itself encouraged constant exchange with no pressure, presuming that in the end we'll all come out even and everyone has enough, and that hoarding won't actually get you any further. Being the richest Hobbit at the festival is more a matter of how much food is on your plate and how many friends are around your campfire, to be honest. A brief little respite from a capitalist society that is not so kind, and where an excess of wealth is just security from want. Being a Hobbit for a week may not have solved any grand world problems, but it did make me realize just how embedded that mindset is, and how easy it can be to untangle that, even just a little bit. In the end, maybe it's community that's the opposite of capitalism.
Yeah.